speaker, Josh Zakim. He is a candidate for Secretary of State, and he is a current Boston City Councilor. Please welcome Josh Zakim.
Thank you for that. Thank you for having me. As you just heard, and I know some of you have some of our flyers in front of you, my name is Josh Zakim. I'm in my third term on the Boston City Council, and I'm running to be your next Secretary of State. My 3 terms on the City Council, I've had the privilege of chairing our Committee on Civil Rights. And it's that work that's brought me into this race to be the next Secretary of State. On our Civil Rights Committee in Boston, we focused on a range of issues ranging from LGBTQ-friendly affordable senior housing, which is a growing issue that we've identified, equity in government contracts, discrimination in the workplace, sexual harassment issues more recently, immigration issues. I'm the proud author of the Boston Trust Act, which is the legislation that just a couple weeks ago, the President came to New Hampshire and criticized us once again for being a so-called sanctuary city, for saying that our police have better things to do than enforce failed federal immigration policy. So I'm very proud of that work. Thank you. I'm proud of it because I think it makes our city safer and more welcoming for everyone. But also these days, I'm proud of anything that upsets that President, and I continue to do that. And we need to make sure that we're standing up for our values here in Massachusetts, which continue to be under attack. And one civil rights issue that kept coming up through this work is voting rights. And the fact that in Massachusetts, it's not as easy to register to vote or participate in our elections as it should be, as it is in many other states. We need to have same-day voter registration in Massachusetts, an automatic voter registration. Make it easier for people to vote by mail or absentee if they can't get to a polling place on Tuesday. And so many other states have done this across the country. 15 states right now have same-day voter registration, including our New England neighbors, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Maine. Automatic voter registration, Maryland, just last week became the 12th state to put that in place. These are changes that dramatically increase turnout numbers, up to 10% in some cases, even more dramatically affecting lower-income communities, communities of color, younger people, people who are often underrepresented in our electorate and in our elected offices, benefit by these. And this is about removing unnecessary barriers to the ballot box. Our Secretary of State is the Chief Elections Officer for the Commonwealth. I think that is the most important part of that position. And we need a Secretary of State who is going to be an advocate, who is going to be a leader, who is going to be pushing for these progressive changes in Massachusetts, because we have an opportunity here to be leaders once again. The way Massachusetts has led back to the days of the Revolution, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, to universal health care, to marriage equality, and right now, in 2018, with a hostile president and the other party undermining voting rights across the country, Massachusetts needs to lead on this. We need to lead on this because it's the right thing to do for the people in Massachusetts, and it will get us better government and better participation, but we also need to be leaders for people across the country. They shouldn't be saying, oh, Massachusetts, it's this progressive, it's this liberal place, they're all blue Democrats there. Why are we behind when it comes to voting rights and voting access? Why do we have nearly 700,000 eligible residents who aren't registered to vote? Why have we seen turnout drop in our state elections 30% over the last 20 years? That's unacceptable. We need a Secretary of State who is going to lead on pushing for those changes. Now, while I think voting rights and administering our elections is the most important role for the Secretary of State, the Secretary's office also is the Chief Securities Regulator for the Commonwealth, similar to the federal SEC, making sure that stockbrokers and financial advisors are behaving themselves, so to speak, and enforcing that. And before I ran for office, I had some experience in that area. I was an attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services, where I worked with families that were at risk of losing their homes to foreclosure. And we did battle with the Bank of Americas and the Wells Fargos in court, and often successfully, but with the help of our government, with the help of President Obama's Treasury Department, with the help of Governor Patrick's administration, with many local city and town governments. And that's the kind of partnerships we have to have, and the kind of approach I would take to the Secretary's office, especially when it comes to securities regulation and partnering with our Attorney General and others. The Secretary is also the supervisor of public records for the Commonwealth, which means that if you request a public document from a local city or town, or from the governor's office, and they say no, your first recourse is to the Secretary of State. And all too often, under this administration, the answer has been a no. They have not come down the side of transparency, and that's something we need to do more of, to restore people's confidence in government, to make sure we're holding our elected officials and appointed officials accountable. Public records should be available to the public. We should be working on digitizing them, getting them online, making it easier for people to request them, whether it's the Boston Globe or whether it's you or I, to get those records that we're entitled to. There's also important regulatory authority over the lobbying industry. In Massachusetts, the Secretary is where they register and regulates the conduct of lobbyists in Massachusetts. That's an area that often is overlooked, and so we need to be making sure we're keeping an eye on it. We need to be proactive on so many of these issues. The Mass Historic Commission, another area where the Secretary is, has a role to play in historic tax credits, and we can go on and on. I know you are all a knowledgeable group, so I'm not going to get into the minutia of all of this. We'll be here all night, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions on any areas of the Secretary's oversight or authority. But I'll just end with this before we go into questions. I think that's what we're going to do most of tonight. We right now are at a place in this country where we need to be standing up for our values. We need to be making sure that we have progressive leadership here in Massachusetts that is showing other states the way, that is showing this country that despite the best efforts of this president and his party, we continue to stand up for what is right. We have come a heck of a long way from when only white male property owners could vote, from when we had poll taxes and tests, but there are too many unnecessary barriers that are still in place, and there's no reason for that. And we need a Secretary of State who's going to lead on those issues and make sure that we do the best we can for everyone across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So, my name is Josh Zakim. I ask for your support, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Somebody brought in a car, a black Toyota Venza and a white Ford Escape SUV.
That's us.
All right, nice of you to say it.
Thank you for being here. I actually remember my grandmother paying poll taxes in the 1960s. But my question to you is that there has been, over the last couple of years, this attempt to have like voter registration, same-day voter registration, and some of the issues that repeatedly come up is the cost of doing that. How do you propose to address that?
So the question is, what would it cost to implement same-day voter registration? Based on the 15 states that already have it and what it costs to do early voting in Massachusetts, the estimates I've seen have all been around $1.5 million for the entire state. And that's something that, again, is based on the experience of other states and what we did in with the early voting in 2006. I keep saying last year, it was 2 years ago. And we need to make sure that's funded, but I'll be honest with you, I know $1.5 million, it's not peanuts. When we're talking about a $44 billion state budget, I don't think it's a huge price to pay for better access and better democracy.
And that compares to states our size?
Similar sized states, and they've extrapolated, per voter. And what's interesting is the costs are usually inverse to the size of the city or town. So, a city like Quincy, it probably would be a negligible cost, whereas a much smaller town, you go to Walpole or Hopkinton, or you could name any of the hundreds of others, because they don't have the infrastructure often in place already in their city clerk or their elections department. But it absolutely needs to be funded, and we need to do that and make sure. And I want to applaud Auditor Suzanne Bump, who went back and got funding for early voting that was not funded by the legislature or the governor from 2016. So we absolutely need to do that, but $1.5 million, I think is very doable.
Thank you.
Yes?
What would you as Secretary of State be able to do unilaterally in terms of securities and bank regulation without, so the legislature isn't exactly the fastest moving body in the world. And I know something like Attorney General Healy has run into a lot of roadblocks and policies that she's tried to implement unilaterally. But assuming that the legislature stays at its molasses pace, what would you be able to do unilaterally to toughen securities regulation on your own that maybe the incumbent isn't doing at the moment?
So I think that's a safe assumption that there will not be huge movement in the legislature on these fronts in the coming year. And I think there are two things. I think one is how the office operates when it comes to securities regulation, making sure that there is a predictable professional response, whether it's to complaints from citizens or through an investigatory process, and being very transparent. I think that's something that we haven't seen as much as we should. I think people are often surprised. I think there was a flurry of activity shortly after I announced for this campaign, and I think we need predictability when it comes to enforcement. And it's about registration and regulation and setting standard codes of conduct. I don't think our securities laws are the problem right now. I think our election laws are the problem. And when it comes to unilateral action on voting access, there's a lot a Secretary of State can do. In particular, when it comes to same-day registration, it's not just advocating for changes in the law, but there was a court case decided several months ago called Chelsea Collaborative versus Galvin, which the ACLU brought against the Secretary, saying that our current 20-day registration deadline was unconstitutional. The Superior Court judge agreed. and laid out quite an interesting roadmap for how we could put same-day registration in place. Unfortunately, Secretary Galvin appealed that case and is currently prosecuting that appeal in the Supreme Judicial Court. If I was Secretary of State, that would be my first order of business, would be to withdraw that appeal and start setting up a same-day voter registration program for the coming election. I think that there's a lot that can be done on this front through executive action in the Secretary's office, but also through being an advocate. You talk about the legislature moving slowly. We all know that happens. We all know that happens whether it's in Massachusetts, whether it's some of our city councils, whether it's across the country. But we need someone who is going to advocate and push for these changes. We may not win every single one of these fights, but to have a chief elections officer who is not pushing for that, not campaigning for that, not using a different platform on a statewide basis to push for those changes, we're never going to get them.
So you touched on it a little bit. What other distinctions can you make between you and Secretary Galvin? And is Republican Amore?
Sure.
Can you just give us?
You're the first person I've talked to who knew the name of the Republican who's running. Everyone says, I hear that there's a Republican running, has been usually what happens.
Well, just to let you know, he's the Director of Security at the Gardner Museum, and I'm a Gardner Heist buff. That's why.
All right. Well, I will preface it by saying he was not the security director when the heist happened, so I'll say that. I don't know much about Mr. Amore, aside basically from what you've already said. You know, I will take it one step at a time. We have a primary on September 4th, and you know, that's talking about the ideas that I have and the way I operate, I think, very differently from Secretary Galvin. My 3 terms on the Boston City Council, I've made it a point of being out in the neighborhoods I represent. That's something I'll continue to do as Secretary of State, not just coming here every 4 years and asking for your vote at the convention or asking for your vote in the election, but being here and interacting with you. My cell phone number and email, my personal email, are right on our website. They're on those cards you've gotten. I think it's the responsibility of our elected officials, whether you're talking about a city council, a state rep, Secretary of State, a governor, to be accessible. People deserve that. It's part of being transparent, answering those emails, engaging with people, not sitting up in our office in Beacon Hill, but being out in communities across the Commonwealth. That's on a style basis. On the more substantive issues that I haven't already touched on, the Mass Historic Commission has broad authority toward historic tax credits to projects throughout the Commonwealth, up to tens of millions of dollars a year. And I think we need to be using that more effectively to make sure that we are supporting low and moderate income housing in high cost communities that need it, but also spurring community development projects, economic development projects in our gateway cities and other communities, and particularly in Western Mass, it's been a little neglected on that front, that we can and should do more with that, and allocating those resources in that manner, and opening up in a more transparent process. Right now, Secretary Galvin's been in office for 24 years, and there hasn't been a significant primary challenge in that time. No offense to anyone who's ever run against him. But what I think we need to be doing and we need to be talking about is not me versus him. It's not about that. It's about why isn't Massachusetts leading on these issues, on so many of them. So the voting rights issues obviously is number one, and I think it needs to be number one for every government official and everyone who cares about democracy in this state. But the other aspects of that office, opening it up. It's not that easy to find out what's happening in the Mass Historic Commission hearings. There's not a lot of transparency or predictability when it comes to some of the Securities Division actions or lobbying registration. We should update our website. We should have an app where people can say, when's the next election? How do I register to vote? We need a civics education curriculum. The legislature is moving a civics education bill, which is phenomenal. But just like our state treasurers have had financial literacy programs that they've put in the schools, and I think I heard that Deb Goldberg's office got to about 40,000 young people in financial literacy. Why don't we have a civics education program led out of the Secretary's office?
Absolutely.
These are not groundbreaking ideas. I wish I could be a genius and get struck by lightning and say, wow, this is the thing to do. These are all happening in other states, and we can and should do it in the Commonwealth. It's a bit of a long answer, sorry. Yes?
I just wanted to thank you for mentioning the difficulty in finding out when elections are happening. I can't believe how hard it is to find out where elections are happening citywide. You cannot find locations like where elections are happening in other cities. You have to go onto all the different city websites to find out that information. It should be more centralized, and I also am worried that it's not necessarily accessible for people who are unable to read the screens directly. A lot of information is in PDFs that are not visible to people with
ADA compliant.
yeah.
So talking about access for folks with disabilities, not just to the information, but to many of our polling locations,
Yes.
is abominable. Now nationally, the turnout rates for people with disabilities is significantly lower than with able-bodied folks, but in Massachusetts, it's a much larger gap. And there's some more we can do about that. One of the problems is obviously our polling locations are often in old buildings, often not as accessible. We don't have centralized training for poll workers, both on what the rules are and how to better assist someone, whether it's because they're blind, because they have trouble getting in there, because they can't, mark the sheet. We need to make sure that there is centralized training. I know even Florida, has central training for poll workers every year. Someone at the door. I would normally get it, but I don't want to give up my time here. And we need to do that. And another thing I think I failed to mention earlier is making it easier to vote by mail. Right now, to vote, it's just absentee voting. We don't really have a vote by mail program in Massachusetts. You have to say and certify that you are either going to be out of your city or town on election day, that you're physically disabled and can't get to the polls, or that you have a religious objection. And there's no reason for that. I think a lot of people don't.
Does anyone have a black Toyota Solara?
I do. There's a black Venza again.
No, it's not us.
Tracy,
But,
Sorry about that.
no problem.
park behind my father's car, look for the XPOW license plate. Right, Dad? Because that's what they usually do during the day is
What kind of car is it?
it's a gray car with XPOW plates. That's why I'm telling you that, because look for XPOW. It's easy, you can park behind him.
So, making it easier to vote by mail. How am I doing on time?
You're out.
I'm out.
And we're out on a Solara.
Yes, I just
You had to ask.
absolutely,
I'm
absolutely.
sorry,
Yeah.
I can't keep my mouth shut, sorry.
No, it's,
Josh, you're spot on the curriculum thing. I will tell you, my niece was born here in Quincy, lives in another state called Missouri. They I know, please. She lives in Missouri, but she's a sophomore, and they learn about the Constitution. They don't just learn civics, they learn about the Constitution and things, and of course, I will say, I did work with Josh in my capacity when I was at the Boston Teachers Union, so I know his work. So something, the legislature will embrace it, and they do move.
They do something.
They do move.
There'll be a
They
few
do
things.
So-
And on the civic stuff, we need, funding for whatever.
They can
whatever
find, it's
we're
amazing,
doing.
What I would always say to them is, you find for other things is a way to do it. And they were pretty good.
Yeah.
So things like this, and there's such movement with the youth when you see about,
Oh, yeah.
Parkland, Florida and all of that.
I'll say one thing and then I'll stop on that.
Absolutely.
When we were at that march, the March for Our Lives in Boston, and we were registering people to vote, my campaign and volunteers and myself, and the highlight of that day for me wasn't how many people were there. It was when we would go up to a group of young people and say, you registered to vote, and they say, oh, we're not 18. And I'd say to them, you can register, you can pre-register in Massachusetts if you're 16 or 17, and their faces lit up. They knew that they needed to show up on election day also, that the march, while it was incredible, was not enough. I think we're going to see a real change, not just in the Commonwealth, but across the country on that. I ask for your support in that. Thank you for those who have signed our nomination papers. If you'd like to stay in touch with the campaign, please sign up there. My cell phone and email, as you know, are on the cards, and I'm getting the look, so I'm done. Thank you very much.
thank you so much. Are you gonna be able to stick around? You got places to
I
go?
think just,
Yeah,
I could be the doorman.
Grab a sandwich before you leave.
Thank you.
And I do also want to recognize